Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development.
Merci, Stephen. Merci à tout le monde pour attendre pour le dernier résumé du rapport de la commissionnaire vérificatrice générale pour l'environnement et le développement durable. Pour moi-même, je trouve ici un dossier d'échecs, de panne sur quelques sujets. Je peux parler seulement de 4, il y a 6 chapitres ici, mais je veux faire un peu de commentaires au sujet de les audiences publiques environnementaux, les études environnementaux, la question de navigation d'Arctique, le changement climatique, puis aussi pour l'évaluation des sables bitumineux. We have a report here that shows essentially a record of failure across many subject areas. And in brief, in looking at the major topics, we have the rollout of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, and a report that I think shows, not surprisingly for anyone who worked on trying to stop the changes that were made in spring of 2012 in Omnibus Bill C-38, it was clear that the act was hasty with an effort to bulldoze through projects. But just as for comparison, you'll find in Chapter 4 of the auditor's report that at Chapter 4, page 2, that they have found so far under SIA 2012, 37 environmental reviews have begun. Just for purposes of comparison, in 2009, 4,369 reviews were completed. We also find in the Auditor General's report a lack of certainty discovered by the audit in terms of what projects will be targeted for review, which ones won't be. There is no transparency around these decisions, so there's no predictability. Also, the auditor found that around questions of who is allowed to participate, there are different standards being used to apply the term interested persons between what's done at the National Energy Board, what's done under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and what's done at the agency. On the question of oil sands monitoring, one of the big takeaway surprises for me is that it's not up and running yet. This was, as you recall, the blue ribbon, gold-plated, exciting new oil sands monitoring coming in decades after the oil sands began to produce. And the auditor, the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, has audited Environment Canada's participation, but it's clear when you read the document that the question is, will it be up and running? As a matter of fact, in the conclusion, if successfully implemented, the joint Canada-Alberta implementation plan for oil sands monitoring will provide a foundation for understanding the impact of oil sands on the environment. By the way, of course, it doesn't include greenhouse gas emissions, nor does it include human health impacts. But I found it disturbing that it was still at the stage of if it is implemented. And the Commissioner found significant questions from many stakeholders about what Environment Canada's plans were for post-2015. The navigation of the Arctic is quite a disturbing report. We don't know enough to have navigation taking place safely with any increase in navigation. We are seeing, according to this report at Chapter 3, at page 14, quote, overall we found that Canadian Coast Guard's ice-breaking presence in the Arctic is decreasing while vessel traffic is increasing. Canadian Coast Guard does not know whether the services it provides are meeting the needs of users. We're already seeing tourist vessels going to the Arctic. As the Auditor General noted, as the Commissioner noted, there are 160,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline. We have no monitoring at all of other toxic and noxious materials. Transport Canada, you'll find this at page 19, Transport Canada has no mechanisms in place for detecting hazardous and noxious substances in Arctic waters. I was very impressed by the picture on page 19. There's a picture of a Sol-7. This is the entire fleet of aerial monitoring of our coastline. This is the National Aerial Surveillance Program's Dash 7 plane, singular, C'est un seul avion, c'est tout le programme pour la surveillance aérienne pour l'Arctique. Considering Stephen Harper's excitement about Arctic navigational wrecks, perhaps he wants more. We've spent much more on the Franklin expedition in focus and attention than on the promised icebreakers. This report verifies that icebreakers will be retired at a faster rate than new icebreakers will be brought on. And of course, the largest failure of all, the so-called climate program, the so-called sector-by-sector approach of Mr. Harper. Of course, it's not in doubt that we're going to miss the Copenhagen target. That's been clear from Environment Canada's reports for some time. The Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development has looked at the graphs that appear on Environment Canada's websites and pointed out ways that they could be more helpful so that people could see what they really mean. I suggest that they are deliberately unhelpful, but at page 24 of chapter 1, you will find ways that the information could be made more transparent. But what's very clear is that the target of bringing emissions to 612 megatons by 2020, representing a 17% drop from 2005 levels. 2005 levels were 737 megatons. By 2020, emissions will be 734 megatons. That's a 3 megaton drop, not the promised 125 megaton drop. This is, of course, not a surprise because there is no climate plan. This report again confirms there is no climate plan. There is no federal-provincial coordination towards a climate plan. There is no internal Government of Canada plan. And the so-called sector-by-sector approach, as my colleague Megan Leslie mentioned, has ignored oil and gas regulations. One of the new findings in this report is this page 10, quote, although detailed regulatory proposals have been available internally for over a year. Now that's what I had heard rumored for a long time. Peter Kent had regulations ready. He was not allowed to bring them out. And although this is a stale-dated promise 8 years old, it's very clear that Leona Aglukkaq no longer even speaks of it as anything on the near horizon. The other point is that the plans post-2020, which of course is Canada, is part of a negotiation. If you ask Leona Aglukkaq in the House, as I do, where do we stand on the negotiation for COP21 for the new treaty to take place in 2020 in Paris? The negotiations are supposed to conclude in 2015, next December. Any representative of Harper's administration will always say Canada is going to take on our obligations under a treaty negotiated by 2015. But this document makes it very clear there's not a single bit of effort anywhere in the federal government towards post-2020 reductions. Nothing's planned. So I think I don't want to take any more time. There's a lot of detail in these reports. Je peux terminer seulement, on dit que c'est vraiment un bilan d'échec. Il n'y a pas le progrès pour réduire les gaz à effet de serre, ni pour sécurité publique pour la navigation dans l'Arctique, ni pour l'étude environnementale. Merci.
Margot McDermott, CBC.
Elizabeth, to the point about the maritime or the marine navigation in the north, are you surprised, though, that there is such a gap between the rhetoric that we hear, or the words that are being spoken, and the interest by the Conservative Prime Minister, and what is actually happening in terms of helping ships get through that part of the country?
Well, it's quite shocking. And of course, it was very clear from every trip that Stephen Harper has made to the Arctic that he steadfastly ignores the threat of global warming and climate change in the Arctic. But one would not have thought he would ignore the need of users. I mean, if they're looking at an expansion even on existing mining projects, as the commissioners Julie Gelfand mentioned, we're looking at potentially 300 more navigations through these waters in the near term in order to accommodate development interests, which clearly interest the Prime Minister. And yet, of the 23 of 43 systems in the Arctic outside Mackenzie River and Great Lake areas have had even an initial review, and only 2 out of those 23 were reviewed in anything like detail, so that it's clear that the shipping industry is demanding that the government do more, and at the same time, they're actually doing less because of, as I said, the retirement of icebreakers. Even with when the new promised icebreaker comes on, it will still be a decreased level of icebreaking capacity when there is increased shipping, and we haven't mapped these areas. It's a significant worry to people who study the Arctic.
Mark Abdul, Radio Canada? No, oh, sorry, Mike Lacuccia.
Yeah.
My mistake.
Today's report comes down saying, no regulations in the oil and gas, and they're, been waiting for them for 8 years. But at the same time, the European Union is planning to drop the label for the oil sands as the crude is being dirty. So, in your estimation, is this government actually being rewarded for dragging its heels on regulations?
No, I think that's a huge stretch. We know the European Union is considering dropping its label, hasn't made that decision yet, and that's a very, in the scheme of things, in terms of our global reputation or how we might be rewarded or punished, that's pretty minor. We're not currently, EU is currently not a market for Canadian oil sands bitumen. I think the larger question of ignoring the climate crisis is clearly a factor, and was a stated factor in the final environmental assessment to the State Department on Keystone. There are many ways in which Canada's failure to regulate greenhouse gases, to have any climate plan in place, is hurting us internationally, and there's no sign that we're going to be rewarded for despicable, actually shameful behavior on the international stage.
So just to follow up on that point, so you're not necessarily so concerned about the EU possibly or considering dropping that label. You don't think that's going to be something that, the Prime Minister can say, well, look, they're dropping the label here, it's not that bad. Is that something that you think could happen?
Well, do I think the Prime Minister will stretch any scintilla of something factual into something that's an outrageous whopper? I think it's quite likely. But the reality of it is Canada has exerted more diplomatic lobbying pressure on the EU over that regulation than anything most European parliamentarians have ever seen. My colleagues in the Green Party in the European Parliament have been astonished by the level of constant application of pressure on them to drop that regulation. I can't say it more forcefully, they've never seen anything like it. In the scheme of things, though, it's really not a major factor in terms of development in the tar sands or the oil sands. We know that they're trying to ramp up to, well, the Prime Minister's target is to go to 6 million barrels of bitumen a day. We're not even monitoring properly yet for what the tailings ponds leach into the Athabasca River. We haven't even caught up with basic environmental monitoring from what the oil sands do in conventional pollution terms, and we're not really, even beginning. We have no regulations in place, and frankly, sector by sector regulations is the least effective, most costly way to go at climate planning. No other government would ever have suggested sector by sector regulations. It's an excuse for delay. It's a justification for procrastination, because frankly, Stephen Harper has never shown any real interest in reducing greenhouse gases, even to the target, which was useless and weak, that he took on in Copenhagen. We have the worst record in the industrialized world, and while Australia is busy trying to catch up to us, that's nothing Canadians can be proud of.
Carl?
So put yourself in the shoes of the government politically. Given what you say and what the commissioner said today in milder terms, so this seems to be a deliberate ignoring of the reality of climate change. What political calculation is the government making with an election coming? How does the government think this is going to fly for them politically?
Well, so far, Stephen Harper has been brilliant at navigating an issue where 80% of Canadians want climate action, and yet he's gotten through the election of 2006, 2008, and 2011 without actually having the issue heard him at the ballot box. I think that's largely because the issue hasn't been part of a political dialogue during elections. I think it's because he's never gone to the people of Canada and said, if you elect enough Conservatives and I form a majority, I promise you we'll withdraw from Kyoto. It's never been part of any Conservative Party plank. So he knows enough to develop the rhetoric that sounds plausibly as though he's addressing the problem, even though his goal is to expand the problem.
Nigel,
Was there anything good in the report?
Well, there's the fact that we still have a commissioner for environment and sustainable development is good. We've lost the National Roundtable on Environment Economy. We've lost the science advisor to the Prime Minister. We've lost most of the science that goes on within the Government of Canada. So I have to say, I think it's a good thing that we have a Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development within the Office of the Auditor General. The report did find that Environment Canada was meeting most of the things it was supposed to do in the very, very slow process of setting up oil sands monitoring. But the performance of SIA 2012 is exactly as anyone would predict who read the bill when it was C-38 before Parliament. SIA 2012 was designed to avoid evaluating projects, to fast track everything. The good thing about this report is that it exists.